We're back. Fulham Fix, new series.
We are back, and for the new series, we've got, you couldn't get anyone higher on a wish list for a Fulham programme than this man.
No, you really couldn't. And I know we say this a lot. We're like, okay, look, this is the biggest guest. This is the best guest we've had so far. This really is. In terms of Fulham as well, it doesn't get any bigger.
Let's be clear, we say that every week, that it's the best guest ever, but this genuinely is. You could book Father Christmas and Paul McCartney, and it still wouldn't be as big as this guy.
Yeah,
Who
agreed.
is it?
It's Roy Hodgson, the one and only. And it's amazing.
Love you, Roy.
Roy, welcome to Fulham Fix. It's an absolute pleasure having you here. How does it feel being firstly in this room, back at Motspur Park? What are your initial feelings?
Well, it's always nice to come back. I've not actually been to Motspur Park. I think I did come once after it's been sort of renovated, but it was an interesting journey through the park again and turning off and into Motspur Park, and I'm impressed by the way everything here has been sort of brightened up in particular, because the one thing about the old building, it was fun in a way to be a part of such traditions and have a building which was untouchable, but I felt it was very dark for the people working here, and even our facilities weren't the very best. So when I came a couple of years ago, I don't remember even what the reason was, and it was all new upstairs, and the manager's office and all around there. It was quite good to see. So it's probably less of a surprise for me this time than it would have been had I not come here 2 or 3 years ago. I think, it would have been at the time. It had been before 2017, I suppose. I've not been here since I started at the Palace.
What were your impressions of Fulham before you joined the club? Did you have historical moments with Fulham Football Club, and what did you think of the club?
Well, I already knew people. Les Strong was a friend of mine even in those days, before I joined the club. And my first contacts with the club were as a spectator, because I was a Crystal Palace fan, of course, and a Crystal Palace boy living only 10-15 minutes walk from the stadium. But Palace were never in the top division, in my youth. The highest they reached was the 3rd Division South before getting relegated to the 4th Division. Wow. So I did actually come to Fulham a couple of times on the bus. I must have been old enough to do that. I must have been 13, 14, 15, and that was in the Bobby Robson, Jimmy Hill era. Johnny Haynes was playing. Yeah. So I remember Bedford Jezar was another. Jimmy Langley. They were the players. They were all players. So it was a very good first division team.
Yeah.
And then my next contact with Fulham, I suppose you could say, was with Bob Robson, when I was taking my initial coaching qualifications at Crystal Palace Centre, and Bobby Robson was running the course, and I got to know him there.
Did you feel an affinity with it? Because one of the things that we always talk about with you and Fulham is that there hasn't been in the history of Fulham Football Club, or in many cases really, a place where the manager exactly matches how we feel about the club. Did you ever feel that with Fulham, like there was some sort of synergy or something being meant to be, or do you know what I mean? Some sort of comparative philosophy there.
Well, it did seem to grow, I must say. And it was a place where I felt very, very comfortable, and I think that synergy was something which I'm not certain that it was there right from the start. It couldn't be. To be fair, when I came back to Fulham, I'd been out of the country for a long time, and in fact, my first ever retirement was actually planned in 2007, believe it or not, all those years ago when I was leaving Finland.
Right.
And not accepting the offer to stay on there in order to go back to Inter and work with the president there in a sort of capacity that a good friend of mine, Giacinto Facchetti, had held as like I don't know what he was really, Giacinto. He was more than just a board member. He was a sort of what would you call it, an ambassador. He was more than that. He was such an icon at the club. So working with the president then, they were quite close together, and he wanted me to fulfil that role when Giacinto died, and I'd agreed to do it and turned down the offer to stay at Finland as a result. And then suddenly I found that one or two people contacted me and said, well, don't retire, why don't you come and talk to us. And Fulham were one of the clubs that contacted me to come and speak to them, and fortunately that led to me being offered the job.
Do you remember the other clubs at all? By any
Yeah,
chance?
well, Ireland, the national team of Ireland, I had a long discussion with them. I think I'd have probably been quite close on their list of potential candidates. And the other one, strange enough, was in the Ukraine to be actually a sporting director, but possibly with a view of taking over the national team in a bit. So they were the three major.
That's interesting, because if most managers would look at that and those options and say, well, the Fulham one is definitely a sinking ship, because we were in a mire at that point. We were definitely relegated in most people's opinion. There'd been a lot of people that Sanchez had brought into the club, which maybe had or hadn't worked.
They weren't quite
gelling. What made you take? Were you thinking we might get relegated and it'll be a 2-year thing of getting back up? What was your vision? How was it sold to you, and what did you feel?
Yeah, I don't remember it really being sold to me that strongly as such. I mean, the meetings I had with David McNally and one or two of the other board members, I mean, none of it really was that pushy in the sense that, this is a job and it requires this, that and the other. It was more about me, I think, and them trying to get an impression of, could we work with this fellow, and do we think his background and his experience could help us out. And strange enough, I went back to Finland because we hadn't finished. It was a very strange. These are long stories. Is it a problem?
We've got time for them.
Literally.
It's a long story that I'd finished at Finland. The season ended when we drew our last game in Portugal against Portugal. That was the final game, and we needed to win it to qualify, and we drew. So we got very close actually to qualifying. So I stopped with the team. They were still paying me to the end of my contract, which I think was end of December or something. So my wife and I decided, well, we'll go back to England for a short while, over just before Christmas, just to sort of see a bit of England at Christmas time. And strangely enough, she chose Torquay, which was a childhood from her Liverpool days. Torquay was a place where her family would travel.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was almost a semi-nostalgic visit.
Sure.
And as I was just about to, come over, I got a phone call saying, look, Fulham and David McNally would like to meet you. Is it possible? And I said, well, amazingly enough, if he wants to meet me, I am actually coming to England to go to Torquay. If you can set something up, I'll do it then. So he said, well, I can fix it. If you'll be coming to Heathrow, right? I said, yeah. He said, what are you going to do then? So I'm going to take a train from Paddington to Torquay. He said, well, I'll get a hotel near Paddington and I'll arrange the meeting there.
Okay.
So I'm all set for that. And then before I set off, I get the phone call from a guy I knew reasonably well called Don Givens. He said, I've been trying to reach you everywhere. I've not been able to get a telephone number. He said, but we want to speak to you. I said, well, who's we? He said, Ireland. That's Ray Houghton, myself and Don Howe. We're desperate to meet you. I said, well, where? He said, well, in England or Ireland, ideally. I said, well, actually, I'm coming to England.
One in, one out.
I'm going to Torquay, and we're flying back on this day. He said, well, we'll come to Heathrow Airport. Could you get to Heathrow Airport earlier? And I'll come to Heathrow Airport with the other two, and we'll talk to you there. We'll get a room, which they did. And I didn't know how the meeting with Fulham had gone, really. I mean, I seemed to get on well with David, but he was very professional, and I didn't necessarily get the impression that he was saying to me, right, you're our number one candidate. But certainly the Irish gave me definitely that impression. And I was on the way home thinking, this is going to be difficult. So I've got to ring Massimo Moratti, the president of Inter, and maybe tell him that I've changed my mind about semi-retiring and coming to work with you, and I'm going to carry on working, and I'm going to take the Ireland job. He phones off on the plane, of course. And as soon as I got off the plane, I looked at it as a message. And it was from David McNally. He said, we need to speak to you again. Could you come back and give me a call? So I gave him a call, and I said, well, how urgent? He said, well, you couldn't come tomorrow, could you? So it was all happening so quickly. Yeah. So I said, okay, I will. And I organised a flight, got picked up. Remember, it went to Stansted, of all places. And all of a sudden, everything was right. We're going to do it. Are you ready? And it was almost as if I took the job without the sort of deliberations some people would have. But of course, we were living in Richmond at the time. I had a place in Richmond. We weren't living there, so it was very
nice
convenient. And it was always a club I admired and respected. And I didn't really give as much thought as I perhaps should have done to, what the point you're making. Can I do this job? Can we survive? Can we get through? And to be perfectly honest, in the early days, it didn't look as though we would, because we certainly didn't hit the ground running in terms of results. Where I thought we perhaps did hit the ground running was the response from the players to the sort of work we were trying to do. And we thought, the coaching staff, Ray Lewington, Mike Kelly and Billy McKinley and myself, we thought, we're seeing some signs of progress. We couldn't prove it because we in fact, there was my one favourite story from that time was we had a player who, you talked about the players that Laurie had brought in. I think, to be fair, he was very unlucky, because I think some of those players were an awful lot better than they were given credit for at the time, and there was more, I think, successes than failures. But that was the general consensus of opinion amongst the crowd. And one of course, was Joe Kamala, who, I liked Joe. I thought he was good fun, but we didn't use him as often as we could because we had other players, and he wasn't popular with the crowd. And one day we were losing, as we often were in those early days, and I stood up to shout something, to say something to one of the players, and a guy from the stand behind, it was very quiet. I mean, it wasn't a noisy crowd behind where we stood.
This was at the cottage, wasn't it?
At the cottage, the guy said, Hodgson. I sort of turned around a little bit irritated that someone should bother me and disturb my concentration. He said, put camera on. I sort of glared back at him with that sort of mind your own business and don't get involved. But I think he saw quite clearly that I wasn't too happy with his intervention. Anyway, the game goes on and we're still losing and things weren't going very well. So we turned to each other and said, what are we going to do? He said, well, why don't we give Joe a go? I know he's got the pace, he might just be lucky, he might do something. So we said to Joe, can we go and warm up? You're going on. So he's by the assistant referee, he's ready to get the board up, to put the board up, and the voice rings out again. Hodgson. So now I'm really irritated.
Quite.
I spun around this. He said, I was only joking. But for me, if I had to sum up my early time at Fulham, that was it.
That's fantastic.
I mean, you must have cracked a smile at that point.
I lauged, I laughed,
But of course,
And
Cameron
he ended up helping us stay.
Cameron ends up being a hero, doesn't he?
He was the one at Man City.
My God.
Him and Eric Neville, they were the two that pulled us through in the end.
Just before that, though, the main turning point in our minds, really. I mean, firstly, it's fascinating that you're thinking about semi-retirement and then thinking about everything that happened in your life since that point. Fulham, Liverpool, West Brom, England.
17 years ago.
It's a whole career that happened after that.
It did.
A lifetime's career that happened after that.
Yes, it did.
But what we talk about at Fulham, that turning point really before all the chaos that happened at the end of the season, is the Villa game and the Jimmy Bullard free kick in the last 10 minutes of the game or whatever it was. What do you remember about that? Do you remember about Bullard as a character, or because it was your first win?
Jimmy very well. I mean, he was a character. There's no doubt about that, and a very talented player into the bargain. The problem for us with him, to some extent, was to integrate him into a quite disciplined and organised defensive unit. I think he caused Danny Murphy more problems than he caused us in a way. But he had to pay a high price for his technical ability. There's no doubt about that, because he made it pretty clear that as far as he was concerned, the tactical side wasn't of any interest to him. It was, I need the ball and I'm going to get on the ball. And our big arguments with him were, you can't keep deserting positions which are important to us as a team to go and pick balls up in unimportant areas, just because you feel you've been starved of the ball for a few minutes.
Sure.
So it wasn't conflict free our time with Jimmy. But having said that, I'm certain I think more of him and more kindly of him than he does of me.
Yeah. Do you think there's always that tension as a manager? Because from a fan perspective, when you're not reading the game as well as you do, obviously, those players capable of magic, you're obviously thinking people want to see more of them, don't they?
Sure, of course.
And that was always really interesting with Jimmy because he keeps us up, and then you get rid of him, and Dixon too, who seems like a much more humble footballer, came in without replacement, and that actually took the team to a whole other level, didn't it?
Yeah, I don't know how much we got rid of Jimmy and how much Jimmy wanted to go.
Right.
I mean, but I probably can't deny that we didn't have a harmonious relationship. But of course, as you say, I mean, his free kick and Danny's header were actually the decisive moments when we did stay in the league. Yeah. But you have to be very careful about crowd favourites because crowd favourites are often, I mean, the favourites before that were Maurice Volz and Johnny Pansel, and they were favourites for different reasons, really.
Yeah.
You know, their guts and also the way they actually sort of cultivated the crowd. I mean, Johnny Pansel used to run around almost shaking hands with a member of the crowd after the games, which, to be fair, Breda Hangeland and Zoltan Garrett and Danny Murphy people I would consider to be probably a bit more important in our play didn't.
Yeah. To be honest, you've just named 3 massive crowd favourites, though. Anyway, I mean, they're all absolutely loved. Yeah. Can we obviously? I think we're talking about it now, but the Great Escape, arguably one of the great escapes in Premier League history. It seemed like it was almost impossible. Was there a point for you that you thought this is too much? We're not going to do this, or did you always believe to the very end?
Well, I think we sort of bought into the keep the faith. I think that was good. I thought the idea of bringing those rattles into the to the crowd and getting them on board because I think traditionally the Fulham crowd's been not a quiet crowd, but it's certainly been a well-behaved crowd. It's not the crowd that you're not famous like you. Going to Fulham, well, Millwall, West Ham, even Palace, really, where the crowd are going to really make life unpleasant for you. Yeah. Never had that sort of reputation. So I think that slogan about keeping the faith and the gimmick of the whatever they were, those fan-type rattlers that people used to use, that helped a little bit. The fact the players never really seemed to give up on it, I've got to say, there was never any thought working with them that they've lost heart here, the players. They've just given up on it. It was more a question of can we produce the performances, which are always going to be hard to produce because we're playing good teams and, we're the ones with the knife at our throat all the time. That was more that. But I didn't really concern myself overly, I don't think. But we got to Man City. And when we were losing at half-time there, I've got to say that there didn't seem to be any way back from that. Right. And yet, that's all credit to the players, there wasn't much to say.
At half-time?
No, there wasn't much to say, really, because we were 2-0 down, I think, and we were relegated.
Yeah, because Birmingham are beating Liverpool, aren't they, at the same time?
Yeah, well, I don't have all those details. I'm sure you're right. But I know that statistically that was the end.
Yes.
Unless we won the game.
Yeah.
And that didn't look too likely at 2-0 down when, Man City have been the better team as well in the first half.
So what do you say? Like, how, as a manager, an experienced manager, what do you say at half-time in those moments? Do you remember what you said? Do you remember the body language of the players as they came in 2-0 down and relegated?
I think there was, they were despondent as they came in, of course, and unhappy because they're not fools and you can't fool them. There's no point in trying to say things that are just going to make you look foolish and they're going to think, what's the point of him telling us that? So I just remember that we talked for a while about, I'm sure we talked about certain tactical elements. I don't remember that we perhaps could have done or should do better, but the one thing I do remember saying, look, let's set ourselves a simpler goal at least. Let's try and win the second half and let's see where that takes us, but that at least is a simpler goal, so let's go out and try and do that. But I don't know where the players found that enormous strength to get back, and I say, I mean, through the season there are players who are unbelievably important in that. You know, the two centre backs, Hughes and Hangeland, Danny Murphy, the midfield, Bullard had helped us out a good deal there, and all these guys have been very, very important, and they seem to, continue to, if not believe, want to have a go at it. But the two then, strange enough, that were responsible for the goals were Joe Cameron and Eric Nevland, who had not played the key roles or the key parts. But Brian was vitally important. Brian was fantastic.
It's a very emotional 45 minutes that. I don't know if you've ever thought there's probably too much happened in your career to have time to look back on it, but it's very poignant at the moment because of Sven's involved for Man City, putting his hands at the end, but also you don't often see this, especially from a Fulham perspective, but people are actually crying behind the goal when that winner goes in at the end. Like it's the heightened element of emotion in that game is absolutely unreal. Did, like, after that game, did you feel, because it felt from my perspective, that hindsight is probably a good easy thing to say, but that we were definitely going to stay up after that point. There's just that swelling of feeling that it can only end one way. Would it have been from internally? I guess you would never think like that, would you?
No, not really. No. I mean, it was, let's keep going. I think we played. Was it Birmingham? We played at home after that.
Yeah, beat Birmingham,
which we beat. But then, of course, we had a tough one going to Portsmouth in the final game. They were having quite a good season. Had a lot of good players. Harry had harnessed a lot of good players from abroad, so it was going to be a tough one. That.
Yeah.
So it was a little bit fairy tale like. When we went there and won that one, and we stayed up.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt, once that happened, and we had stayed up, I thought then we would definitely kick on and do well.
Did you?
Yeah. David McNally was very good in the first instance. When I talked about Hangeland and Nevland and Terry on loan we had. We had the left back from Finland who'd worked with me for a couple of years, was a very modest player. We had him, but they never, said, well, we don't know them, or we don't want to buy them, or we don't want to take them on board. We had to pay money for Nevland and Hangeland.
Yeah.
And the same with Andy Johnson, of course, who we brought in, and then of course Bobby Zamora and Johnny Panzer came in the following year. Damien Duff came
Zoltan
in.
Gira.
And Gira and Schwarzer.
Schwarzer, yeah.
Most important. But I mean, these people cost money, and we had to get them on board and over the line, and it was backed up by the sporting director. We didn't have a sporting director per se. It was Dave McNally, and then he left, and Alistair came in.
Yes.
Before, because I think that leads us beautifully into year two, as it were, your first full season in charge. But just before we move into what ended up being our highest ever to this day Premier League finish,
that will change.
That you think? That's nice to hear.
Under Marco, you think?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And if he's unlucky enough, then someone else. Records are there to be broken. The way the club is progressing at the moment, all records are liable to be beaten. If Marco gets a higher finish, and good luck to him, and hope he does, then he will have to accept that one day he'll have to probably understand that it might get beaten again. The way the club's running, you've got a chairman here who I've only met a couple of times and don't know, but he certainly has invested an enormous amount of money into the club. So if that continues, and the quality of players that you're now signing, you just signed Joe Anderson, who I've got enormous respect for,
and we love him here.
Love him here. You sign in players of that quality from rivals like Crystal Palace. That sounds good. So sorry to interrupt.
Well, no, my one last thing on the Great Escape. When we did, it's just something the kind of juxtaposition between the fans and yourself. When we stay up, 76th minute header, full-time whistle goes. At Portsmouth, iconically. You're kind of stony-faced, whereas and the juxtaposition between the fans losing it, doing what the impossible, and I've got goosebumps thinking about it. Why? Can I ask why? Was it because you're like, right, business? Did you almost have one foot into next season? Were you thinking?
No. I think it's simpler than that. I think I was so concerned that it might not work out. Earlier on in the season, I think I'd primed myself more for this might not work and this is going to be a disappointment, which would have been a shame because I was enjoying it here and I was fearful, I suppose, that it's not going to work out, and I understood that if that's the case, that would be the end of my tenure here. So I think that game, the tension of it was such that I was determined not to try and show too much of that to the players, at the game. I didn't want them to see how worried or how upset I would be.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it was 0-0 and it didn't look like we were going to get the goal as well. I think it was more a question. I think I forced myself to come to terms with this might not work for us here.
Yeah.
And when it did happen, it was almost, I can't believe that, all the fears and concerns and, I suppose the scenarios I've been building up and imagining, all of a sudden, with this goal, they've disappeared.
Yeah.
And so I think that was more that than anything else.
It's so fascinating, isn't it, in football, how these little moments actually change lives internally.
Oh, yeah.
And it's
Well, it certainly changed my life.
Yeah, and everyone at Fulham
Well,
Football Club.
many. I mean, it's not the only moment in my football life which has changed it, of course, because it goes back such a long way. But if we take the last 17 years, since coming back to England in 2007, or just on the verge of 2008, that period of time owes everything, if you like, to that goal and that victory and that chance to continue at Fulham. And there's sliding doors moments, without a shadow of a doubt. Had it been 0-0 and people would have said, well, you came close and it wasn't a bad effort, but it would have been relegation and I'd have been moving on, and who knows, maybe I would have decided then, okay, I'll ring Inter again and I'll go there after all.
And that entire pack of players would never play for Fulham, all those people that are idiosyncratic with the club now, and it just would have been a different landscape as we think about it.
To be fair, we're doing this podcast here, but this podcast could be being done with clubs all around the world, really, speaking to someone. That is also what football is.
Yeah. And
it's probably what makes football so important to us all.
Roy Hodgson, in a detailed and reflective mood there, it's much more than we probably thought that he ever would be. We should say that he doesn't actually do podcasts as well.
Yeah.
So to catch Roy like that really was like a very unique and rare sighting, and we've got a whole other episode of conversation on the Europa League final season, which is very worth waiting for, because Roy's just the greatest, isn't he?
Oh, unbelievable.
Ivan, I couldn't help but notice that you and me look much smarter than usual. Is
well,
that just for Roy?
I think it is just for Roy. Let's make that very clear. We don't get smart for many people, but clearly someone at Fulham were like, I'm worried about Felix, I'm worried about Ivan. They're scruffy. The pair of them are scruffy. We need them looking smart for royalty, Roy royalty. And so Charles Tyrrett have kindly sent us a couple of garbs so that we were presentable in front of Roy Hodgson. And I think we brushed up quite well. I don't know about you.
And we will be back and presentable with Roy for part 2 coming out very soon.